This is a continuation of our discussion on how someone with a neurological oversensitivity disorder can live a bold life. In acknowledging the bad of the range of socially acceptable behavior, we can discover how to do so. The problem with neurotypical behavior is the espoused norm and practice norm are often at least different, if not diametrically opposed, as with the case of the emperor's new clothes. This arises largely from ego distortions, where baser human impulses id override group norms, superego, to get what it wants. It is at odds with Freud's original positive definition of ego, which is the regulator of baser human impulses, in accordance with societal norms. Nazi Germany points out that some very unethical thinking can be accepted as moral by a group. This is slightly different than perverting a norm in a disingenuous fashion to meet one's needs. The failings of Nazi Germany were outrageous, but by no means an anomaly in the range of human behavior, merely an extreme. Germany does honor its failings and monument a national psyche today, and has flourished as a great country as a result ever since. In the absence of a great arousal, like World War II, to correct such failings, rather than vigorously addressing our own failings, we write stories and create film for young adults to urge them to fight the good fight. The Maze Runner, the Divergent series, The Hunger Games, Ender's Game, Firefly. All these films portray young people confronting the evil imposed by adults. Such evil is never imposed for villainy sake, as a cartoon villain might do. It almost always is done with a wrapping of virtue that has led to the word ego becoming so reviled, despite Freud's original positive phrasing of it. Fighting the good fight is so easily taken up because we all of us have to deal with some form of tyranny, bullying, and abuse during our lives, especially early in life. One hopes not from a primary socializer, but child abuse and worse is possible for everyone. The fact that everyone has to come up to their socializer standards is just part of the socialization process. When those standards exceed socially accepted norms, we call it Stockholm Syndrome. The fact that everyone needs to do this leads to extreme forms of ableism, which will always challenge autism in becoming socially acceptable. I had my own version of this during high school where I thought ill of basic students. All you need to do, I would say to myself, is work hard at school. But many of these students didn't have anyone to even show them how to read. Those circumstances alone wouldn't stop them from being successful in life, but you had better bet that such limitations would impose severe constraints on their lives. I've discussed the weakness of autism as a function of how severe the autistic's neurological oversensitivity is in relation to the harshness of the environment. I've also been saying that an autistic's challenges in life are the same as those for everyone. There just might be a lack of intuitive understanding of the human condition and the strategies to be successful in light of its constraints. My purpose in this blog, in discussing taboo topics, is to enable autistics to be successful, notwithstanding their neurology. I did fail in understanding my own ableism for the limitations of autistics in my high school's so-called basic students. In developing strength, I failed to consider the lack of opportunity and limitations of others who had not developed strength in a socially acceptable way, e.g. through education. We must all guard against such failings in perspective. How harsh and abusive taught norms are in relation to the child's sensitivity threshold are a big determiner of the child's future. We discussed this in Chapter 2 when I discussed oppositional defiance disorder. For the autistic, it seems the strategy for dealing with this is a drive for correctness. Neurological oversensitivity is not a peculiarity of autistics. There is a diagnosis of highly sensitive person that seems to distinct from autism. Some of the conclusions I've reached about my own nature, which I've extrapolated to autism, come from reading books on this type of person. The desire to avoid mistakes, correctness, is also common to this class of person. Of course, no one wants to make mistakes, but the differentiator is the ego distortion, where someone willfully wraps their needs in a possibly willfully or blindly misinformed claim of virtue. This is socially acceptable behavior, whether or not lying is involved. It can be differentiated from a misstatement of truth after the fact to cover something up. So in the autistic, we have someone who has an oversensitive brain, breeding a strong drive for correctness to avoid threats to the self that may impose a barrier to the autistic meeting his or her own baser needs, if only as compared to the capabilities of his or her holistic peers in that respect. Arguing virtue in a flawed way with the hopes of the socializer will accept the child's invocation of virtue, argued in accordance with the socializer's instruction of virtue, even mistakenly, can be an anathema to the autistic. This might leave the autistic unwilling to accept the socially acceptable behavior from others, understanding given human nature's zero-sum needs, but also potentially leading to justifiable claims that autistics lack empathy. Such claims can easily reach into the realm of dark empathy in other contexts, so I advise autistics not to take such accusations to heart. Frankly, they should usually just be discarded. The word empathy is too loaded and fraught with improper intent on the modern tongue. The autistic's neurological oversensitivity drives an aversion to socially acceptable good and bad ego, the means by which we meet our needs, and instead clings tightly to a perception of correctness. This can become clinically relevant as a lack of ego strength, possibly needing psychiatric medications to stabilize. The autistic's drive for correctness from the teaching of virtuous norms, fighting the good fight, can become a strong source of justice, creating a significant change agent in the world. Since these norms are so directly taught, the autistic may lack a level of caution to keep his or herself safe. The emperor's new clothes seemingly teaches one thing, but for the autistic, the main caution has to be to avoid pointing out the emperor's nakedness. This notion abstracts to all other forms of fighting the good fight, and a level of social savvy is needed before actively fighting those fights. The world needs change agents, but such initiative needs guarding and caution, the need for which is hardly apparent given how heavily these norms are taught. But the tyranny of today is in place for various reasons. It could be from politicians supporting big builders who in turn fund campaigns, leading to a housing affordability crisis, the easiest solution for which is relaxation of minimum square footage laws, but that is only starting to be done right now. Tyranny could arise from the insecurity of the individual seeking a like-minded pack. The pack could be a political party, possibly seeking to protect its dominance from a change in ethnic mix. It could be from the authority figures poorly trained for the weighty function they perform, but who nevertheless seek to cling to their authority and dominance, like police officers. Police officers are not law enforcement agents. They use the law to enforce the norms their political masters value. There is a great ego in what they do, both good and bad. The police don't work for you because you pay taxes. They work for the politicians. That is a dubious proposition, but an important differentiator that needs to be borne in mind. There is always some baser need driving the tyranny of the day, which could be the tyranny of yesterday in modern form gone to hide a new virtue, modern racism. With all the problems still facing the world today, arising from the insecurity and baser needs of those in authority, there is seemingly a lot of work to do. Courses like the Landmark Forum argue that we should all feel and be responsible for all of it, rising up to correct these problems. The Advanced Landmark Forum argues that we should not accept arguments like there are only 24 hours in a day, to avoid feeling responsible for the problems in the world. They are both right and wrong. You shouldn't detach from a responsibility for change, but there are only 24 hours in a day. Also, how much change you take on is something that should be constrained to a lesser extent than the time you might have to invest in it. Donating to charities like the Institute for Justice is a great way of doing this in more ways than one. Actively taking up change as a direct change agent by yourself is something that needs extreme caution. The need for change arises from tyranny, generated in the manner discussed, which is to say someone in authority has vested interest in it. As discussed in previous chapters, people rally around the norms authority figures set, sometimes because of virtue, but often because doing so is how they meet their own needs, good or bad ego, the quid pro quo. One need many of us have to varying degrees is having agency over our own lives. When we don't have agency over our own lives, this sometimes drives us to want to have control over others. Watch the ending of James Vanderbilt's Nuremberg to get one author's possibly fictional expression of this. The rules of today are heavily entrenched, whether or not they make much sense because of this. So seeking to become a change agent to fight the tyranny of today and the lingering remnants of yesterday's tyranny become a dangerous proposition. You are fighting someone else's needs, however base or virtuous they may be. Autistic social savvy in this respect needs to start as early as possible. In high school classroom debates, the autistic should consider abstaining from rebuttals, not because to do so is virtuous, but because it starts to build a socially wary mind. As an adult, setting out to square off arguments about virtue can be a very socially dangerous thing. When norms are used as weapons rather than to advance virtue, you could quickly have one or more crosshairs pointed at you in some respect. You have to pick your battles, even considering abandoning ones that you think are important. I've given caution about repudiating the underlying racist thinking of others in previous chapters. It's something that at least needs caution. When you come under attack by virtue from others, consider not responding or reacting. If others can force you to react, they can control you. Also, matching yourself and others is strongly seated in self-control like this. You should normalize not informing other people of your side of the story. Asking a question that provokes a contradiction is something to be considered alongside a non-response. Young people feel these forces potently, and so it can be a very difficult habit to break. Your mother's admonishment to just ignore it should be reconsidered if you abandoned it in favor of perpetually defending yourself, which I did when I was young. Deciding when to respond is something I perpetually am in doubt over. I don't have a good formulation to share with you. The fact of the matter is there's a lot of room for making mistakes in this respect in life. As I've said, I bring my conclusions to you after having made every socially mistake imaginable. Almost none of these have caused me any long-term grief. You are obviously free to discard everything I've said. If you do so, I invite you to keep what I've said in the back of your mind while forming your own conclusions. What I've learned has helped me to find stability and vigor in life. I hope it can help you. Coming to the conclusions to which I've arrived and finding that vigor has led me to one or two significant mistakes I have to assert extreme caution over. First, I have to strongly caution you against going up against a government agency on your own, either through open commentary at public hearing or through declaratory actions in court. This will very quickly paint a target on your back that you absolutely do not want to have. These bodies often have direct control over police who can conspire against you. For instance, the Institute for Justice was forced to challenge a second criminal action brought against one of their clients in a retaliatory fashion by a county prosecutor. The county prosecutor supposedly brought the charges because the IJ's original action had undermined the county revenue sources derived through policing. These people are dangerous, stupid, and arrogant, a terrible combination to have in light of the authority they wield. The effect is measurable by North American mass incarcerations, children taking guns to school, and people storming legislative buildings. If they don't have indirect or direct control over the police, the proposition becomes less certain. If part of your motivations for doing it are freedom, personal or otherwise, consider how much freedom you have to do and have over other things, i.e. meet your needs. Leaving such matters to charities like the Institute for Justice is often best. Consider bringing your case to them. But if you do, bear in mind that the police officer's discretion might work against your favor when you do actually make a mistake, and there might not be a lot you can do to avoid the following negative consequences. The second mistake I made is to mix my personal and private inventive endeavors with my employer, irrespective of whether or not you're a contractor or a regular employee, leading to a good fight to preserve my personal interest in the invention. The invention wasn't, quote, worth his time, unquote, at the outset, but he changed his mind and we applied for military funding, for which we successfully received a Phase 1 award. We had a decent layman contract in place that made it clear the invention was mine. My employer would get the R&D dollars and would pay me a wage. In exchange, he would get a sliver of the production profits, the majority of which would be mine. His understanding of the technical significance and revenue potential of the invention eventually improved, and he started to get grabbly, clearly beyond what we had agreed to in the contract, while still trying to decisions that might undermine the technical success of the invention. See Robert Greene's 40 Laws of Power. Never outshine the master. Reflecting back on some of his commentary, he seemed to think engineering in the 80s, when he did mechanical engineering, was just as good as today's engineering. No need for any improvements or inventions. Recall I discussed this mentality in Chapter 4. As a contractor, I always try and give more than I get. So near the end of Phase 1, I started drafting proposals for other research grants that my employer would own. I got laid off at the end of Phase 1 with the hopes that Phase 2 was just around the corner, but congressional delays have extended this layoff to 7 months. And for the first time, I found I cannot find a job, let alone within the normal 2 weeks it has always taken me to find a new one. I am now 7 months unemployed. A couple of months into this, I called the director of engineering at my company and asked if they were blocking me from finding a new job, to which the director responded, "We are worried we'll go out of business and need to find new jobs." The director has a 2-income family. His wife is an optometrist, whereas I'm a 1-income household. Additionally, after my layoff, they started making claims they were going to repurpose part of the grant for profit rather than technology investment, which would generate more money later. I got upset and hired a lawyer, but there's not much we can do. Reflecting back, I put myself in the position where my partner can control whether I found a new job while waiting for funding. I also made it them not to allow me to move on because they would be dependent on me for the grants I wrote. They are necessarily in complete control of my finances now. I'm sitting and waiting somewhat patiently. As I said before, the clouds always part. The only challenge is not to allow bad situations to cause you to react and make things worse. I've also done this at the 4-month mark, mix the 2 do nots I've just described at once. The clouds will part, though. And one has to bear in mind that there's a very strong zero-sum component of human nature. It exudes the collective subconscious, as with the case of Abraham's son. Authority will sometimes want to see you give something up for no good reason, simply for the sake of giving things up. If the word submission pops into your head, you will set yourself up for failure instantaneously. You have to tell yourself social grace. I can gain from or minimize impact by complying with this, instead of using the word submission. On the other hand, you can't let people use this path to undermine you and your goals. I can offer no guidance on the threshold for this. It will be determined by your confidence, the markability of your skill set, your existing social fit, etc., but most importantly, your risk tolerance. To exercise social savvy in this situation, you need to consider if you should let the other person win if tolerable. Minimize your threat profile to them. Human nature is zero-sum, not because it has to be, but because there's a game theoretic force driving it to be. Being able to intellectualize this aspect of human nature will greatly help you in coping with the emotional reality. And the most important instantiation of this is avoiding saying no. When young, being able to wield this word is the first step to building confidence and agency in life. Very quickly, however, it will become socially undesirable, including with your peers and subordinates. Instead of saying, "No, I'm not doing that," you need other strategies. Asking questions that leverages your opponent's vanity to force them to realize the right course. Backpedaling and avoidance are other alternatives. Passive disobedience can be a socially acceptable strategy. You should expect to receive some of that when you are in a lead position. Passive disobedience is almost certainly a bad idea for a new career grad or a new company hire. I've seen it done successfully for more senior people, and I've hated it and its effect. The fact of the matter is, it may be necessary, but it rests on the premise that you are right. Are you? Are you accepting of the consequences if not? I had a captain Navy tell me to feel free to challenge one rank up. That's a forum where obedience norms are most potent. Like honesty, obedience is a norm that can and should be modulated. Learning to do it properly is something to be done with care and slowly in your career. I've seen peers reject direction that is too great a compromise of their work and ultimately selves. I've thought ill of their disobedience, but I can respect that there can be too great a sacrifice of the self when obedience is concerned. But you can't do this in every scenario, and you have to be prepared in life to suffer losses, both fair and unfair. As so often stated, you also need to consider when to strategically let your opponent win. Note that disobedience with open opposition will never be a good idea. And so I have to return to my informal diagnosis of oppositional defiance. You will recall my discussion from Chapter 2, where I rebutted the potential by the free market commentary of my skill set. I have always been free to move on to another higher paying job with better opportunities. Thought leaders encourage people to pursue such skill sets so they can set the terms in part just in this way. You will also recall that the abuse I described of the child I mentioned in Chapter 2 had this ODD diagnosis. Researchers agree there's no single cause or even greatest single risk factor for oppositional defiant disorder. Rather, it is best understood in the context of a biopsychosocial model in which a child's biological vulnerabilities and protective factors interact complexly with the protective and harmful aspects of his or her environment to determine the likelihood of developing this disorder. They say psychosocial without mentioning child abuse here. In one community study of children with oppositional defiant disorder, 14% had coexisting ADHD, 14% had anxiety, and 9% had a depressive disorder. The authors of another study found that children with oppositional defiant disorder were twice as likely to have severe major depression or bipolar disorder compared with the reference group. Oppositional defiant disorder has commonly been regarded as a subset and precursor of the more serious conduct disorder. Some researchers conceptualize conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder less as a separate disorders, but rather as differing primarily in the severity of the disruptive behavior. Author researchers consider the two as entirely separate disorders. Other researchers consider the two as entirely separate disorders. A certain amount of oppositional behavior is normal in childhood. Oppositional defiant disorder is only distinguishable by the duration and degree of the behavior. Clinicians use the term pervasive drive for autonomy within the autistic realm. PDA actually started out as pathological demand avoidance, probably by some blowhard psychologists who couldn't anticipate the harm the term could do, like the one who invoked empathy within the context of autism, refrigerator psychologists. Other psychologists have softened the term by saying pervasive drive for autonomy. Other interesting variants of PDA include RDA, a rational drive for autonomy. I think this is in line with the autistic's drive for correctness and reliance on rules to set boundaries. As I've said, this is a serviceable but slightly maladaptive in a world where people inappropriately wrap their baser needs in authority figures espouse virtue in order to have needs met by the authority figure. Authority figures are used to using rules to their benefit, including discarding the rules when they don't suit them. This can be bad and good for the individual. You can fight the good fight, or you can be accepting of the negative outcome for yourself, with hopes that future positive outcomes will accrue to your name. The threshold for this will become highly personal. You don't necessarily need to let people walk on you. We've been discussing ways of being assertive in the face of the normal range, the bad parts of that behavior. The fact of the matter is, we all need to have some way of setting boundaries with our environment, especially with authority figures. Involuntary sexual acts incur the protection of the law, but moving along the spectrum of tolerance of intrusion into self from others, things get more difficult. In adulthood, you will have to abandon the notion that rules can keep you safe from the abuse of others. Where the police are concerned, the phrase, "you will never win with them," has to ring in your head. I've used language in the past to effect, "you better have your cell phone out if you want to resist them." And that choice of language, I have to emphatically admit now, was completely wrong-headed. You will never win with the police. I have never bothered to investigate what the rules for resisting arrest are. I'm not going to do it now. The only time it makes sense is if your life is in peril from the police. You had better bet the common law rules are practically bent out of shape to that effect. Battered housewife syndrome points out how difficult setting these thresholds can be. Some battered women choose to say in these scenarios, "The syndrome is too complex to judge, but it points out another spectrum of human behavior. Accepting abuse from others, even with the neurotypical's distortion of the word empathy. The threshold you use needs to be determined in the context of the fact scenario, your psychology, and risk tolerance. We all have to accept varying forms of abuse from others to some extent, not with suffering, but with great guile, to maintain a sense of self. Doing otherwise would be to descend into Dostoevsky's The Idiot. So we have the confluence of numerous terms like ODD, conduct disorder, RDA, and PDA. When is it permissible to say no? When is it okay to fight for yourself? Psychologists have all these terms with no crisp differentiation between them. The fact that there's no open admission from them that abuse can lead to ODD and conduct disorder is extremely alarming to me. And in light of the apparent reality of the modern use of the word ego, where a subordinate invokes a virtue espoused by the authority figure in the hopes of having his or her needs met, irrespective of whether the virtue intersects with the need, I have to wonder if psychologists have been wittingly set up a situation where all power goes to the authority figure, and the submission of yesterday's crowns and castles is still alive today. The use of the term refrigerator parent should not have disappeared. I wonder if a change in tack from the APA would bring a modern reality of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, where smoking marijuana was never something the judiciary could wipe away with the word reasonable. Such a world would have a pervasive drive for autonomy as a completely social acceptable norm. And again, I don't smoke marijuana here. You need to develop assertiveness with the social worry I've discussed, under the understanding that you do need to give things up sometimes. Letting other people win needs to be part of your socially savvy strategy. This might mistakenly seem intolerable, which might be rooted in your inability to modulate your honesty and obedience norms within the socially acceptable range. As I said, this is true even in the military. The path to assertiveness and agreeableness with a balance for opposing tyranny is a precarious thing to manage for anyone. The autistic may need to set more conservative thresholds to be safe with full consideration given to the vulgar aspects of the socially acceptable range of human behavior I've been describing.